Well, one of the things that seems to be most attractive to people who are observers rather than living in the system, and let's use Latin America as an example, let's use El Salvador as our example, is the perception that though distasteful, some of the actions that a president like Bukele has taken, there is a belief that it's been highly effective and therefore perhaps the ends justify the means. As
That
an analyst, how do you view that, and how would you counter that very attractive argument that this is what it took to instill law and order in a place that seemed beyond reach for it?
that's a valid question. And for some people in El Salvador, the ends have justified the means for some. For many others, however, they say, wait a second, this isn't what we're not a police state. We don't take 80,000, 90,000 people, many of whom are innocent, whose only crime is to have tattoos that somebody claims represent a particular gang or something. That's not what we're really all about, especially if we're not going to give them habeas corpus, we're not going to give them a trial. Oh, and also we're also going to have a president that violates the Constitution and maneuvers the constitutional courts into letting him run for a second term. One thing after another. Your solution looks good in the very short term, but as many people who see, yes, let's get the bad guys off the street, are saying, hey, but you're taking my friend's son, you're taking innocent people, and where are the democratic human rights and civil rights for free trial and stuff? Actually, if you look at El Salvador, Bukele came out of the party FMLN, which was the guerrillas during the civil wars, which ended back in the early 1990s. He was not, as far as I know, a guerrilla, but he came out of that party, which was hugely corrupt. And he actually left the party because the party rejected him. And then he decided, okay, I'm going to tear the whole house down. And that's what he has been doing. So yes, short-term problem. We need to get bad guys off the street. But what's really behind it? And also there's another Bukele bit of this. I don't have firsthand information. I'm a victim of lack of access, but I'm an analyst as well, and my job has always been to look at patterns and try to assign a certain amount of credibility to what's said. FMLN presidents and the other party, Arena presidents, and Bukele have all found ways to cut deals with the gangs. There's a negotiation that goes on, and that is, if you reduce the murders, we'll reduce the arrests, things like that. And what they wind up doing sometimes is arresting boys, because most of these are just boys. They're arresting boys that have been fingered by competing gangs to get them off the street because they're competitors. In the bigger sense, if you really want to deal with gangs in El Salvador, you have to go back to square one. And that is, the government has to reoccupy the spaces that the gangs have taken over. These gangs don't mount civil wars against local and state level. They don't use the word state, but the local and state authorities. They walk in because the state and local authorities are so corrupt or so underfunded or so vulnerable that the gangs don't have to fight. They just go in, they wind up being the local government, they wind up being the major employer in these areas, they wind up taking the sons away from the women who are working at almost slave labor, slave wage jobs and stuff, and then they take over. You want to solve the gang problem? Yes, you've got to do arrests, but you also have to give them trials. You have to give them credible things, not put them in concentration camps. And you have to address the underlying causes, the underlying drivers of the problem.
Yeah, it almost feels like when you have a leader who pushes this concept of, we need to pull back on democratic institutions. It's almost finding the lazy way out because it's easier to say that you'll solve by simply violating the principles of democratic norms than to do the hard work within the normal institutions of rebuilding and making it hard for criminals and others to operate in that space. So
Exactly.
do
Exactly. Rebuilding and rectifying, because sometimes you do have something to work with, but you don't just destroy.
Yeah, do you see that is those are the societies that are most vulnerable to these types of leaders are those where the government in its let's say some of them are more mature than others in their liberal democratic values, but let's say they were making the attempt but they simply fell short. that it's in those societies that these types of leaders gain the most traction because of a disillusionment with what they have seen to date from a more traditional definition of democracy?
In some of the ones that are, I think you used the word more mature, in the more mature democracies, no. But in the ones that are climbing out of, as in the case of Hungary, Poland had slipped quite a bit and seems now to be more on track than it was before. Those that are climbing out of historical burdens in Latin America, there's a lot of history weighing down things that are hindering institutions. And frankly, one of the problems is the the elites, the wealthy elites of these countries, have never really stepped up to be a leadership class. Some people like to use the word oligarchy. Oligarchy sounds like it's coordinated, but in much of Latin America, part of their burden is that everybody's in it for themselves. There's not really much coordination, and even in countries with that we see from outside as having relatively developed economies, the elites pay almost no taxes whatsoever. How can you have a modern country that's going to produce wealth for your elites if the elites don't pay taxes to protect the society, to grow the society, to build institutions, even to build roads and sewage and electricity for people? And so those ones, yes, you're right. The burden has been the institutions just never caught up. They weren't up for the task. And then the temptation is to do, quote, the easy thing. But we also have a phenomenon of slipping among the more developed countries that had vibrant democratic institutions and checks and balances, such as we're seeing at times in certain elections, some scary things going on that sound very illiberal in places like the Netherlands, even some parties in Germany, and certainly in France, you have this voice that keeps coming back that want to move away from the liberal democracy model, but they don't exactly say where they want to go. But as for like the United States, there's really no excuse for saying that our institutions had failed. Maybe you could say our leaders had failed to provide solutions, or you could maybe say that the feeders of American democracy, whether they be the media or the Congress, which has a disgracefully low turnover rate and stuff, maybe what they did, they missed opportunities to do what Jefferson called these rebellions, and that is to give power back to people, to real people, and really do, to steal a slogan from Barack Obama's campaign, change that we can believe in. Because in the end, with Barack Obama, it was Michelle that had more change that people wanted to believe in. And they isolated the people that could be, whether you like everything that a Bernie Sanders would say or an AOC would say, whether you like it or not, democracy requires that you have polls, that you have these two things. I don't call them extremes because we have no real extremes in the United States. Our most extreme, quote, lefty, who calls himself a socialist, is actually a minutely left of center politician in European and Asian terms and stuff. So we have to look at the whole system rather than just the leader saying, "Oh, we've got to make these changes. Let's do it the easy way."